teach private voice and piano lessons after school every day, and work at a convenience store all day Saturday and Sunday just to make ends meet. I was unhappy, stressed to the max, 100% sedentary, and obese. I was a hot mess the day that it happened. I was working with some students on some choreography, and I remember I couldn't get my feet moving, and my brain got jumbled, and I knew I was in trouble. And I didn't have a doctor because I couldn't afford a doctor, but I taught piano lessons to a girl whose father was a doctor. So I called him up and I went over there, and all I remember from that day was I couldn't figure out how to walk down the hall. And he looked at me and he said, "You need to get to the hospital." And he set me up with some tests. So the wonderful stubborn person that I was, I drove home, took care of my kitties, and drove myself to the hospital. Woohoo, not my best move. So I spent the next several days over Thanksgiving break in a hospital room filled with cards and flowers and pokes and prods and doctors and nurses because they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me because I was so young. And come Monday morning, the doctor walked in and said, "Well, we think you probably had a stroke." Probably? And that you're lucky if you regain 60% of your function. Right, and so that was a sucker punch for me because at that time, I looked like this. My leg was dragging, I had no use of my arm, my face was down here, my speech was jumbled, my brain was jumbled. I couldn't do my job like that. So I reached out to my parents in Florida for support, and my mother's response was, "Do you want us to come up?" Well, I realized that that's when my survivor instinct kicked in because I knew I needed to do this by myself. And the final blow was when they discharged me from the hospital with no PT or OT access at all. I was left. And so I sat with a keyboard on my lap every day and I'd pick up my hand and I'd make my hand move and I started walking because I needed control over something in my out of control life. I went back to school in January and I stayed there for a couple of years and I took a different job. And I became friends with the phys ed teacher, as chorus teachers usually do. And she was a cross-country coach and she got me started into running. And damn did I latch onto that because it was cheap, it was convenient, and my uncoordinated body, I could do that, I could run. And so I ran and ran. I ran through a bad marriage. I ran through an even worse divorce. And most importantly, I ran as fast as I could from who I was as a stroke survivor. And over the next 8 to 10 years, I ran like a mad woman. I ran myself ragged. And in those later years, I met my second husband, who was a runner, but he was an all-around active kind of guy. And he skied and he windsurfed and he did all these great things. And I looked at that and it didn't stick. So I just kept running. Because pretty stubborn. Well, I turned 45, fast forward a few years, and I realized that teaching didn't feel right anymore, and I found my way to massage school, and I'd never had a massage before. However, I followed my heart, and I did double duty for a year, so I was teaching and going to massage school at the same time, and so I didn't have enough time to run, and that became the softening, that was the beginning of the softening of Cindie. So I started my practice and we got a dog. Yay. And I found my way to some great local trails so that my dog could be free. And I started to realize I started to be free. I was in the woods, I started to be free. So I started to go back to those trails and I'd run on those trails and I'd search out some other local trails because I needed to figure out what was this that I was feeling because it was different than I'd ever felt before. Zoom ahead, I'm 50 now. And my now second husband took me on a trail run up where we now live in Maine. And it was rocky and rooty. And we ran up mountains and I was dirty. And I loved it. The harder the better. And so I found my way by myself out into this vast expanse of trails. And I started to feel different. And I started to realize that when I was in the woods, I felt calm and centered and energized and grounded. And that was very different for me because I was like all the time. And I also realized that when I disconnected from all technology and the world, I connected to the earth and who I was. And I started to invent me, and I bought a bike, and the softening continued. And I spent all kinds of hours on these trails, and I started to change, and then I discovered yoga. And I burst open, because yoga made me better. It made me a better athlete, it made me a better human, and it allowed me permission to realize who I was as a stroke survivor that was active. And I started to realize, oh, I don't have to look like everybody else. I gotta be outside, I gotta be on the trails, and I gotta move. And so life started to change. And I am now 62, and I've run a road marathon, a trail marathon, lots of trail races, and I did my first trail 50K at 60. And there'll be more. And I realized that I am living my balanced, joyful life finally. I need to be outside. I need to ground nature because I'm filled up. I need to run tough trails. I need to challenge myself, and I need variety. And I'm out in the woods in any weather. You can come with me anytime. I will bring you out. And so that's how I discovered who I was. And so I'd like to leave you with two thoughts. And if they resonate with you, awesome, hold on to them. If not, poof, out the window they go. So the first is, life hands us challenges all the time. And usually I've discovered along with those challenges, these little tiny signs that are saying to you, you know, you better get that stuff up and bring it up, get it out, move on. And you do that. Or you choose to ignore those signs, bury your head in the sand, push everything down and figure it's all gonna be just fine. That's what I did. And I got a big kick in the butt from it. And I wouldn't wish that on any of you. So, when life hands you those challenges, will you choose to suffer the results and be a victim? Or you choose to join me in kicking ass every day and being a survivor? The choice is up to you.